Hello everyone, I'm Professor Zhong. Welcome to my class. In today's class, we are going to go through interest rates and the money markets. In today's class, we are going to go through some important topics in the money markets. The first one, I will give you a clear definition of the money. What is money? What are monetary assets? Okay, so the financial instrument in the money markets, we are going to cover several instruments, financial instruments, such as debt securities, or treasury bills, or Fed fund, and so on. So, firstly, I will give you a definition of monetary assets, and next, we are going to go through the supply of money. Who supply money or monetary assets in the money market? Also, we also cover the demand of the money. Who need monetary assets to conduct transaction, okay, or to hold this kind of assets? So we will discuss the willingness to hold monetary assets. And after that, we will construct a model of real monetary assets and the interest rates, and also discuss the exact relations between monetary assets and the interest rates. How to determine equilibrium interest rates in the money market is very important. Now, in this section, here I would like to give you a clear definition of money. What is money? As we mentioned money, we think about money, we will think about the cash, right? We can make payment easier. Actually, in the money market, when we mention the money in the financial market, actually is a broad definition. A broad definition means any assets, financial assets, we can use as a means of payment. Actually, we can call the money. Or more precise to say is monetary assets. Okay, so here I give you a definition of money. Money is an asset that is widely used as a means of payment. Any stuff or any financial instruments, we can make payment. Or other stuffs to make a payment easier or engage the transaction. Actually, we can call the monetary assets or money, right? For example, in the prison, the prisoner, they have the transaction with each other, right? So what kind of the means of payment for prisoners? Actually, they will use the cigarette. So cigarette actually play the payment tools, the tool of payment for each prisoners, right? For each prisoner. So the cigarette will be the money or monetary assets in the prison or in jail. And the different groups of assets may be classified as money. So money can be defined narrowly or broadly. For example, currency in circulation, like cash or checking deposit or debit card accounts from a narrow definition of the money. Okay. About excluding the narrow definition of money, here we have the broadly definition of money. The broadly definition of money, any financial assets, okay, they may act as a substitute for the money or narrow definition of money. We call the broad definition of money. Okay. In this session, I would like to group monetary assets into two parts. The first part we call liquid assets. The other part we call illiquid assets. When we define the monetary assets, actually we can use the monetary asset to make payment easier, right? So-called the monetary asset we call liquid assets. Liquid assets means the financial instruments or financial asset, we can make payment easier. It can be easier to use to pay for goods or service, or repay the debt without substantial transaction costs. For example, like cash, right? Cash is a good example for the liquid asset, right? Why? Because cash is more liquid asset, is the best liquid asset compared to other financial assets, right? When we make payment in cash, it's easier for us to make payment, or any merchant or any store or firms, they will accept the asset in cash, right? So when we make payment in cash, actually without any substantial transaction costs, so we can group the financial asset in two parts. The first part we call monthly assets or liquid assets. The other one we call illiquid assets. Illiquid assets requires substantial transaction costs in terms of time or efforts or fees to convert them to fund for payments, right? For example, if you have the time deposit in your bank account, if you want to make a payment, it's not easy, right? You have to go to the ATM or go to the commercial banks, right? And withdraw your money or cancel the contract. If you deposit money as a time deposit, actually you sign a contract with the commercial banks. If you want to withdraw money from the commercial bank, actually you have to cancel the contract, right? And withdraw the money or transfer the saving deposit or time deposit into the demand deposit and or checking deposit. And you can withdraw money easier, make payment easier. When you can't cancel the contract, actually you will lose lots of interest because you default the contract, right? So we can group the time deposit or saving deposit, this kind of financial asset, into illiquid asset or non-monthly assets. That's why non-monthly assets or illiquid assets require substantial transaction costs in terms of time. For example, if you want to cancel the contract of the time deposit, you have to go to the commercial banks and sign the document and negotiate with the commercial bank. You want to cancel the contract. You want to withdraw money immediately, right? And you will lose of your interest on holding time deposit, right? So there's another transaction cost on holding illiquid assets. So let's make comparison with the two kinds of financial assets. For monthly asset or liquid assets, what advantages on holding this kind of asset? As you know, if you holding the cash or checking deposit, okay, you can write a check. You can make payment immediately without substantial transaction costs, right? You can make payment easier. But the disadvantage on holding monthly assets or liquid assets is you will gain little interest, even no interest. For example, if you hold the cash as a financial asset, actually you will not gain any interest on holding cash or checking deposit. If you deposit your money as a checking account, you can write check easier, make payment easier, but actually you also gain no interest on holding checking deposit, right? Or even demand deposit. Demand deposit for personal account, you can save your money as a demand deposit. You will gain interest, but actually the interest is pretty low because you can withdraw money easier, right? So the commercial bank will give you a very low interest rate on your demand deposit, right? And compared to the monthly asset or liquid asset, here we have a liquid asset or non-monthly asset. What are advantages on holding illiquid asset or non-monthly asset? Actually, such as the time deposit or saving deposit or maybe the mutual fund. If you hold this kind of asset, it's not easier for you to make payment immediately, right? You have spend lots of time or convert them to funds to make payment, right? And you will face maybe a substantial transaction cost. But what are the advantages on holding this kind of asset? Actually, if you hold a mutual fund, you will gain more return relative to cash or demand deposit. If you hold time deposit, actually you will gain higher interest on holding this kind of asset, right? So for these assets, I mean illiquid assets, they generally earn a higher interest rate on or return on holding this kind of asset compared to multi-assets. And in this session, let's make a conclusion here or summarize here. So according I mentioned before in previous slide, here we can group financial asset in two parts. The first part we call multi-asset or liquid asset. The other one we call non-multi-asset or illiquid asset, right? Actually, the demarcation between them is arbitrary. Why? Because the currency in circulation, checking deposits, debit card accounts, saving deposit, time deposit are generally more liquid than bonds, loans, deposit of currency in the foreign exchange markets, or stocks, real estate, or other assets. So the demarcation between them is arbitrary. And in this session, let's discuss, here I would like to construct a money market, okay? When we mention a market, just like a commodity market or good market, we will have a supply and the demand side in the market, okay? So here, let's discuss the supply side of the money market. Who control money or multi-assets in the money market is very important, okay? But here, I want to clarify my point. When we mention the money, actually money represents multi-assets. The multi-assets, I will give a broad definition, right? The multi-assets will include cash, checking deposit or debit account, and the demand deposit. You can make payment easier. You will face a lower transaction cost, even no transaction cost, right? But the disadvantage on holding this kind of asset, you will gain little interest or even no interest. Okay, so when we mention money supply is actually a supply of multi-assets. Okay, now let's discuss who supply multi-assets in the financial market, in the money markets. Okay, as we know, who control money supply in this country, as we know, is the central bank, right? The main function of central bank, they can control the quantity of money or multi-assets in the financial markets, right? So the central bank substantially control the quantity of money that circulates in an economy we call money supply. In the US, here I give the title, the real name or title of the institution of the money supply control. We call the central banking system. Okay, the central banking system in the US we call the Federal Reserve System. It's very famous, the noun in the financial market, right? So the central banking system in the US, actually we can call the central bank in the US, right? But the real exact title we should call Federal Reserve System. The abbreviation name of Federal Reserve System you can call Fed, F-E-D. The Federal Reserve System directly regulates the amount of currency in circulation in the money market. And it also indirectly influences the amount of checking deposits, debit card accounts, and other multi-assets. Also, through the control the quantity of money, the Fed also can indirectly control the Fed fund rate, even the interest rate in the US money market. Now, let's discuss the demand side of the money markets. Okay, the demand side of the money market who need money or monthly asset to make payment or to consider these tools as investment tools. Okay, so we call money demand or aggregate money demand. Okay, so money demand represents the amount of monthly assets that people are willing to hold. Okay, instead of illiquid assets, we call money demand. For example, people want to hold cash or checking deposit or demand deposit instead of other financial assets such as stocks, real estate, and so on. We call the money demand. Okay, now let's discuss why people want to hold monthly assets. In previous slide, I mentioned the disadvantages on holding monthly assets or liquid asset is you will lose the interest, right? So the opportunity cost on holding monthly assets actually is the return on non-monthly assets or illiquid assets, right? But why people want to hold monthly assets? Even they gain lower interest, no interest or little interest, because it's very convenient for them to make a payment, right? So here we have to let's discuss the motivation on holding monthly assets. Okay, so here we want to discuss what influences our willingness to hold monthly assets. Okay, and we will consider individual demand of the money and the aggregate demand of money. Okay, so for the point of view on personal demand or individual demand, we have to discuss the motivation on individual demand of money. Also, the motivation on aggregate demand of money. Okay, now for the personal, why for the individual want to hold monthly assets instead of non-monthly assets? Okay, so we have to discuss the influences or the factors, what factors or influences demand on money for individuals and institutions. Okay, for the first one, the first factor or the first influences is interest rate. Okay, if you hold monthly assets, actually you will gain little interest rate or little return, right? So the little return on the monthly assets actually obvious is lower than return on holding the monthly assets, right? But for the personal issue, personal willingness to hold monthly assets, why they want to hold the monthly assets? As we know, the higher return on monthly assets, they would like to hold more monthly assets instead of other financial assets. But the actual rate of return on monthly assets actually is lower, way lower than non-monthly assets. Okay, so as interest rate go up, that represent if you hold monthly assets, you will lose higher interest, right? Because as interest rate go up, that represent the interest on holding non-monthly assets also increase, right? That will let people want to hold more non-monthly assets relative to monthly assets and reduce the aggregate personal or individual demand of money. Okay, and the second one is risk, right? The risk represents the risk of holding monthly assets principally comes from unexpected inflation, which reduce the purchase power of money. As we know, if you hold monthly assets, what risk on holding monthly assets actually is your purchasing power of money, right? As the inflation rate increases, that represent the same amount of money you will buy less goods or products, goods or services, right? You will lose your purchasing power of money. Okay, so it's a risk, especially for the unexpected inflation. happens, right? But here I want to emphasize, when we mention the risk, also if you hold non-monetary assets or illiquid assets, you also face the risk, right? So many other assets also have the risk. So this risk is not very important, defining the demand of the monetary assets versus non-monetary assets. And the last one, liquidity. Liquidity is very important factor or influences for the individual demand of money. Why? Because why people, for personal, for individuals or institutions, why they want to hold monetary assets? Okay, the main concern or the main factor come from the liquidity, right? Liquidity represent you can make payment easier. Okay, so liquidity means a need for greater liquidity occurs when the price of transactions increases, or the quantity of goods bought in transactions increases, right? If you want to buy more goods or services in the market, in the good market, you have to conduct the higher transactions. You will need more monetary assets to conduct transactions, right? So here, liquidity is very important. Okay, so the liquidity represent the transaction costs on holding the financial assets. Okay, the higher the liquidity of asset for individual demand of money, the individual demand of money will increase, right? So liquidity is also very important motivation on holding monetary assets for individuals. Now, let's discuss the aggregate demand of money. Okay, when we mention the aggregate demand money, actually we can aggregate the personal individual of money, aggregate them or gather them together. Okay, to discuss the aggregate demand of money. Okay, so for people, why people want to hold monetary assets instead of non-monetary assets? Okay, we have to discuss the main reasons. Okay, the first one, as I mentioned before, is interest rates. But here I want to emphasize the interest rates represent the actual return on holding monetary assets, non-monetary assets, not monetary assets. Because in previous slide I mentioned, if you hold monetary assets, actually you will gain no interest, little interest, or even no interest, right? So, but when we mention the interest rate in the market, okay, the interest rate in the market represent the actual return on holding non-monetary assets, or actual return on holding the other assets or the illiquid assets. Okay, it's very, very important. So monetary assets pay little or no interest, so here the interest rate represent the actual return on holding non-monetary assets. The non-monetary assets such as bonds, loans, deposits is the opportunity cost of holding monetary assets. So here I want to emphasize, as interest rate go up, what does that mean? That means if you hold the actual the non-monetary assets, the actual return also go up, right? If you hold monetary assets, you will lose the higher interest, right? So as interest rates go up, they represent the opportunity cost on holding monetary assets also go up, also goes up, right? And the people, what people make decision? The people best decision is they would like to hold more non-monetary assets instead of monetary assets. Finally, reduce the aggregate demand of money. Okay, so here we can make short conclusion here. A higher interest rate means a higher opportunity cost of holding monetary assets. Finally, lower the aggregate demand of money. Okay, so here we can find out the negative relations between interest rates and the aggregate demand of money. Let me repeat again. As interest rate go up, that represent the opportunity cost on holding multi-assets also goes up, right? And the people, they will engage in the rational decision. They will make a investment decision. The decision is they would like to hold more multi-assets instead of multi-assets. Finally, reduce the equity money. And the second one is prices. The prices represent the price of goods and services, or level of average prices of goods and services. So if prices go up, prices going up, that what does that mean? That means if we want to buy the same amount of goods and services, we have to pay more multi-assets, right? Pay more money. We will need more multi-assets to conduct transaction. Finally, increases the equity money. Okay, so the prices is related to the equity money. I try to explain the channel between the prices and the equity money. Okay, so the prices represent the prices of goods and services bought in transactions, will influence the willingness to hold money to conduct those transactions. Okay, so the channel here, I want to clarify the channel. A higher level of every prices means a greater need for liquidity to buy the same amount of goods and services. Finally, increases the equity money. Okay, so the exact channel between the prices and the equity money, actually we can find a positive relations between them. So as the prices or level of every prices goes up, in order to conduct the higher transaction, the high value of transaction, people need more multi-assets to conduct a transaction. Finally, increases equity money. And the last one is related to the income, right? So the income represent the amount of value on holding goods and services, right? So greater income implies more goods and services can be bought, so that more money is needed to conduct transactions. So the higher the income, the higher value on buying the final goods and services, right? To conduct higher transactions, we need more multi-asset to conduct transaction. Finally, increases equity money. So here, I want to clarify the exact channel. We also find the positive relations between the national income, the income represents national income, and the equity money. Because a higher real national income means more goods and the services are being produced and bought in transactions. In order to make the payment, the higher payment, or conduct the higher transactions, people need more multi-assets, okay, to conduct transaction. Finally, increases the equity money. Okay, so here we can find out the positive relations between national income and the aggregate demand money. In this slide, we will summarize the three factors. How three factors affect the aggregate money demand. Okay, so in this slide, we will construct a model of aggregate money demand. As I mentioned in previous slides, we have three main factors will affect the aggregate demand money. Let's review. The first one is national income. And then we find out the positive relations between national income and the aggregate demand money. As national income increases, or the higher the national income, the higher the aggregate demand of money. The second one is interest rates, right? We find out the negative relations between interest rate and the aggregate demand money. As interest rate increases, that will reduce the aggregate money demand. And the third one is related to the prices, right? The prices represent all the prices of final goods and the products, right? All final goods and the services. So, or you can, the prices represent the level of every prices on buying the final goods and the services. So, we also find out the positive relations between the prices and the aggregate money demand. The higher the prices, the higher the aggregate demand money. Now, let's summarize the relations between the three variables and the aggregate money demand. So that we can construct the aggregate demand of money, or the aggregate money demand function, as like this. Okay, MD, capital MD, represent the aggregate demand of money. And on the right hand side, here we have other variables. Or here the variables are. Let's explain the variables. The first one, P, the P represent the price level, or the level of every prices on holding or on buying the final goods and the services. Okay, and the second one, Y, capital Y represent the real national income, the real national income, and the other variable R, the R represent the measure of interest rate on non-monetary assets. Okay, so R represent interest rate. The interest rate should precisely to say is represent the interest rate or actual return on holding non-monetary asset or illiquid asset. And the LRY represent the aggregate demand of real monetary assets. Okay, so we combine the three factors. The three factors will affect the aggregate of money. The first one, P, price level. The second one, R, represent the interest rate on non-monetary assets. The third one, Y, national income, represents national income. And we also find out the exact relations between the three variables and the aggregate demand money. Such as P, as you can see, the higher the price level, the higher the aggregate demand money. Okay, but the second one, R, we can find out the negative relations between them. The higher the interest rate, the lower the aggregate demand money. Okay, and the third one is national income. We also find out the positive relations between national income and the aggregate demand money. The higher the real national income, the higher the aggregate demand money. Okay. Or here I also show you the other way to illustrate the aggregate demand money. This way is the real monetary asset demanded. Okay. So here we have the aggregate demand of real monetary assets, or aggregate real money demand. Okay, the aggregate real money demand function we can show illustrate as the functional form MD over P. Actually, we only shift or move the P, the price level, from right hand side to left hand side. Okay, so MD over P represent the real aggregate demand. The real aggregate money demand function we can express as MD over P equals L. L actually is the liquidity asset demanded. Liquidity asset demanded actually is the monetary asset demanded, right? So L here I represent liquidity asset demanded, right? So it's a functional form. Liquidity asset demanded is functional form of R and the Y. Okay, so we have two ways to illustrate the money demand. The first way we call nominal form is a aggregate money demand function. Okay, MD equals P times L, or functional form of R and Y. The second one is the aggregate real money demand function. The aggregate real money demand function we can show as MD over P equals liquidity asset demanded of functional form R and Y. And now, according to previous line, we can derive or construct the aggregate money demand model, right? Okay, according to the previous model, we can find out the variable interest rate, the relationship between the variable interest rate and the aggregate real money demand, right? We can find out the negative relations between them, right? As interest rate increases, that represent the actual return on holding non-monetary asset also increases. Due to the opportunity cost on holding monetary assets increases, the rational people will choose, willing to hold more non-monetary asset instead of monetary asset. Finally, reduce the aggregate demand of money, right? So we can find out the negative relationship, just like the red line. The red line represents the aggregate real money demand curve, okay? So we can find out the negative relations between interest rate and the aggregate real money demand, right? So for a given level income, real money demand decreases as the interest rate increases. That's why we can derive a negative sloping curve, just like the red line. And as shown in figure 2, I would like to show you the effects on the aggregate real money demand schedule. Because here I want to emphasize what factors will shift the aggregate real money demand curve. As you can see, if the interest rate, actually the interest rate is endogenous variable, as interest go up, the aggregate real money demand will decreases, right? Otherwise, increases, right? So we can derive the negative sloping curve. But what factors will shift the aggregate money demand curve? As you can see, just like real national income, right? The real national income increases for a given interest rate. Other things remain the same, and we fix the interest rate. When real national income increases, what happens? As I mentioned before, the higher the real national income, the higher the aggregate demand of money, right? To conduct the higher transaction, right? Because as the price level of final goods and services increases, people want to buy the same amount of goods and services. They have to need more monetary assets to conduct higher transactions, so that they will need more monetary assets to conduct transactions. Finally, increases aggregate money demand, right? That's why their behaviors will shift the aggregate money demand curve, shift to the right. Okay, so here I show you increase in real national income will shift aggregate money demand curve to the right. When income increases, the real money demanded increases at every interest rate. Now, here we will construct a model of money market. In previous slide, we construct the aggregate demand model, the model of aggregate demand. How about aggregate supply? Actually, the monetary supply controlled by central bank, right? So here I would like to show you how to construct the model of money market, right? We can combine money supply and the money demand, put them together to construct the model of money market. Here I give you a definition of the money market. The money market is where monetary or liquid assets, which are loosely called money, are lent and borrowed in this market. So in the money market, is a transaction in terms of monetary assets, right? Okay, or we call the money. Monetary assets in the money market generally have low interest rate. Here I show you the features on holding monetary assets, right? If you hold monetary assets such as demand deposit or checking deposit, if you own the demand deposit, actually you will earn very little interest. If you own the checking deposit or cash, you will earn no interest, right? So monthly assets in the money market generally have low interest rate compared to the interest rate on bonds, loans, and the deposit of currency in the foreign exchange markets. And the domestic interest rates directly affect the rate of return on domestic currency deposit in the foreign exchange market. So the higher the interest rate, that means the higher you will face the higher return on holding non-monetary assets. And now, how to construct the money market? We will combine money supply and the money demand in this market, right? So let me show you. When money market achieves an equilibrium, that represents there is no shortages and no surpluses in the money market. Okay, we can call the money market achieves an equilibrium, right? Or we call them market clear. It's a market clear condition with no shortages or surpluses of monetary assets exist. The model achieves an equilibrium. The shortages means assets demand, or you can say there is no assets demand and no asset supply in the market. In the money market, we can call the money market achieves an equilibrium. So here we can construct an equilibrium condition. When the money supply, the aggregate money supply equals the aggregate money demand, there is no asset demand or no asset supply in the money market, we can call the money market achieves an equilibrium. The other way to illustrate money market in equilibrium, we can use another form. In previous slide, I show you, actually we can construct the aggregate real money demand or aggregate real money supply. Actually, we can divide every prices or all prices of goods and services on both hand side. Okay, so we have another form to illustrate money market in equilibrium. Okay, when the quantity of real monetary assets supplied matches the quantity of real monetary assets demanded, the model achieves an equilibrium. Okay, so as you can see, the other way to illustrate money market in equilibrium, here we have from the aggregate demand, aggregate real money demand. When aggregate real money demand equals the aggregate real money supply, the equilibrium condition holds. That means the money market also achieves an equilibrium. So here I show you, we have two ways to illustrate money market in equilibrium. Here I would like to use the figure to illustrate my point. And let's move to the figure 3. Figure 3 shows you how to determine equilibrium interest rate in the money market. As I mentioned before, we can construct the aggregate real money demand model, right? The model of aggregate money demand. And we can derive the negative sloping curve. The red line represents the aggregate real money demand curve, okay? So as interest rate go up, that will reduce the aggregate real money demand. Otherwise, increases the aggregate real money demand, right? How about real money supply? The real money supply function, let's back to the previous slide. Aggregate real money supply function, as you can see, because the aggregate, the quantity of the money supply controlled by central bank, right? So actually it's a policy variable. The central bank would like to control money supply directly control the interest rate, right? So it's a policy variable. We can consider policy variable as an exogenous variable. We can pretend it's a constant variable, right? So MS over P represent the aggregate real money supply, right? So it's independent from the interest rate. No matter interest rate go up or go down, the money supply, the aggregate real money supply will remain steady. Why? Because the money supply controlled by central bank is a policy variable. Okay, so the central bank would like to use the control money supply indirectly control interest rate. This is why the aggregate real money supply is independent from the interest rate. Due to the main reason, that's why when we draw the money supply, aggregate real money supply, actually we can draw the vertical curve. So as shown in figure 3. So how to illustrate real money supply curve? As you can see, the blue line represents real money supply is a vertical line. Why? Because as I mentioned before, the aggregate real money supply is independent from the interest rate. So the central bank, the central banking system of the country, they want to control money supply indirectly control interest rate. That's why it's a policy variable. Okay, now we can combine the aggregate real money supply and the aggregate real money demand to construct the model in the money market. When money market achieves an equilibrium, let's review the condition, okay? The formula. As the aggregate real money supply equals the aggregate real money demand, there is no shortage or no surplus in the money market. We can call the money market in equilibrium, right? So when money market achieves an equilibrium, what does that mean? That means when money market achieves an equilibrium, when there's no shortage or no surplus in the money market. But let's consider another scenario. Then the other scenario is when there is an excess supply of money assets. There is an excess demand for interest-bearing assets like bonds, loans, and deposits. And people with the excess supply of the money assets are willing to offer or accept interest-bearing assets by giving up their money at a lower interest rate. So here I want to emphasize, if initially the money market doesn't achieve an equilibrium, what happened to the market? Okay, how do the money market adjust into the equilibrium? So here I show you the exact channel. If the interest rate is above the equilibrium interest rate, in this scenario, they will have an excess supply of money assets. Excess supply of money assets will accompany with excess demand for interest-bearing assets like bonds, loans, and deposits. And what happens? Okay, the market mechanism. How market mechanism works? In this scenario, people with excess supply of money assets are willing to offer or accept interest-bearing assets at lower interest rates. And others are more willing to hold additional money assets as interest rate falls, right? So their behavior will pull down the interest rate until to equilibrium interest rate, okay? On the other hand, if there is an excess demand of monetary assets, in this scenario, I would like to show you as the interest rate is lower than equilibrium interest rate. So at this moment, there is an excess demand of monetary assets. There is an excess demand of monetary assets exists. That means there is an excess supply of interest-bearing assets like bonds, loans, and deposits. And what happened to the people's behavior? People who desire monetary assets but do not have access to them are willing to sell non-monetary assets in return for monetary assets that they desire, right? So their behavior will push up the interest rate. Why? Those with the monetary assets are more willing to give them up, and in return for the interest-bearing assets as interest rates, okay, rises, okay, because the opportunity cost holding money rises. So their behavior will raise the interest rate until the interest rate achieve the equilibrium interest rate. So here I show you from this figure. as I mentioned before, as you can see, if the equilibrium interest rate is at R1, as you can see, the real money supply equals aggregate real money demand, right? So while the money market achieves equilibrium, that means the real money supply curve must intersect the aggregate real money demand curve at point 1, right? So at point 1, we can determine equilibrium interest rate at R1. But now, if the initial interest rate at R2, what happens? As you can see, at R2, as you can see, the real money supply is greater than the aggregate real money demand. So in this scenario, as I mentioned before, there is an excess supply in the money market. The excess supply in the money market will push the people change their behavior. The people behavior changes will pull down the interest rate, right? Okay, so their behavior will pull down the interest rate from R2 to R1. The interest rate will decreases until to R1. On the other hand, initially the interest rate equals R3. At R3, as you can see, the aggregate money demand is greater than the aggregate real money supply. So here we will have the shortage. There is a shortage in the money market. With the shortage in the money market, what happens? So people are willing to hold money assets, right? So their behaviors will raise up the interest rate, cause interest rate to rise from R3 to R1 until to point 1 achieves an equilibrium. So here I would like to show you the adjustment procedure, the process in the money market. If money market is in equilibrium, actually people's behavior, their asset allocation will pull down interest rate or raise up the interest rate until the interest rate equals equilibrium interest rate, until money market achieves an equilibrium. Now, in this section, I would like to show you what factors will influence interest rate or cause interest rate to rise or to fall down. Okay, now as shown in figure 4, I would like to show you the effect of an increase in the money supply on the interest rate. So as you can see, if the central banking system of this country want to lower interest rate, how could the central banking system control interest rate and pull down the interest rate? As you can see, actually they can use the money by using the monetary policy. Monetary policy means they can control money supply. The way to control money supply, for example, maybe they can purchase government bond in the money market, right? Okay, the central bank of the country can buy the government bond, or print out the money, buy some financial instruments from the commercial banks. Okay, if the central bank push the policy we call OMO, open market operations. Open market operations means the central banking system purchase the government bonds from commercial banks, right? And they will print out the lots of the monetary assets, and release monetary assets by the government bonds, release the monetary assets to the commercial banks, and in order to increase its money supply. And how to affect interest rate, as you can see, when they push the OMO, open market operation, and increases money supply, as you can see, the policy will shift real money supply curve to the right, from N1 over P to M2 over P. Okay, so initially the equilibrium interest rate equals R1. After central banking system push the OMO policy, increases money supply from N1 to M2, their behavior, the action of the central bank will shift aggregate real money supply curve to the right. Okay, and reduce interest rate. Why? Because initial interest rate equals R1. after the central banking system increases money supply from M1 to M2. So as you can see, at initial interest rate R1, there is a surplus in the money market. The surplus in the money market will lower currently interest rate and pull down the interest rate from R1 to R2 until achieve a new equilibrium at the point 2. Okay, so here we can make conclusion. An increase in the money supply lowers the interest rate for a given price level. Okay, so here we assume other things remain the same. We only change a variable, one variable. The variable is aggregate money supply. Aggregate money supply from M1 to M2, right? So the central banking system increases money supply from M1 to M2. Finally, reduce the interest rate, cause interest rate to fall from R1 to R2 until to achieve a new equilibrium at the point 2. So here, we also can imply, we can also get another implication. Otherwise, a decreases in the money supply raises the interest rate for a given price level. Okay, so here, on the other hand, if the central banking system decreases money supply, aggregate money supply, what happened to the interest rate? It's the opposite result to the previous case, right? So the policy will lower, push, or shift the real money supply curve to the left, right? And raise up the interest rate. The other factor I would like to talk about the real income. If in this country, due to the economic performance perform very well, what happened to the interest rate? Okay, so here I give an example to illustrate my point. If the real national income of this country increases from Y1 to Y2, what happened to the interest rate? Other things remain the same. Okay, aggregate money supply remain the same, prices remain the same, but now only change the one variable. The variable is national income. The real national income increases from Y1 to Y2. Other things remain the same. As real national income increases, as we know, that will shift the aggregate real money demand curve, shift to the right? Other things remain the same. So what happens? Initially, interest rate equals R1. Okay, aggregate real money demand equals aggregate real money supply at point 1. Now, due to real national income increases from Y1 to Y2, the factor changes. The factor will shift the aggregate real money demand curve to the right. Okay, when the aggregate real money demand curve shifts to the right, what happens? As you can see, at the initial interest rate at R1, there will exist a shortage or excess demand in the money market. The excess demand in the money market, as you can see, at R1, now the aggregate real money demand is greater than the aggregate real money supply. So there exists the excess demand in the money market. The excess demand in the money market will push the people's behavior changes, right? So their behavior will raise up the interest rate from R1 to R2 until achieve a new equilibrium at the point 2, right? So here we can make conclusion. An increase in the national income increases equilibrium interest rates for a given price level. As real national income decreases, that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Finally, reduce the interest rate. That's all we have for today's class. Thank you for your participation.